programming only on statewide Iowa Public Television, a resource for Iowa's future.
Lee DeForest, Edwin Howard Armstrong, David Sarnoff, radio pioneers, men who transformed American lives but shattered their own. Empire of the Air, the men who made radio.
See it on Iowa Public Television, January 29th.
Iowa Public Television.
TV worth watching. IPTV.
Acquisition of this program was made possible by Friends of Iowa Public Television. And funding for the Iowa broadcast is provided by Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, since 1861, an environment for academic excellence. And by CRST, a family-owned company based in Iowa and a major truck carrier in the United States, which is proud to support the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour.
Good evening. I'm Jim Lehrer in New York.
And I'm Judy Woodruff in Washington. Right after the news summary on this Wednesday, we'll focus on the question of whether corporate executives in the U.S. are getting paid more than they're worth. We have a background report and 3 guests. Then, the murder rate in this country that keeps on rising. KWAME HOLMAN looks at the grim statistics, and CHARLAYNE HUNTER-GAULT talks with 3 experts about why the situation doesn't get any better.
Funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour has been provided by PepsiCo. Part of helping the world live and communicate better is keeping it well informed. That's why funding for the NewsHour is also provided by AT&T and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
President Bush proposed sending more U.S. aid to the former Soviet republics today. He did it in opening remarks to a Washington conference called to coordinate world aid for the new states. 54 nations and international organizations are represented. Mr. Bush said he would ask Congress for $645 million in new technical and humanitarian assistance. That would bring total U.S. aid to more than $5 billion.
The U.S. cannot and will not falter at the moment that these new states are struggling to embrace the very ideals that America was founded to foster and preserve. I would like to reiterate the importance of seizing this moment to commit ourselves individually and collectively to an opportunity that may not come our way again in our lifetimes. The prospect that our former adversaries may become our friends and our partners.
There was another urgent appeal today from Russia for more Western aid. It came from the Republic's top economic official. He said the aid was needed to prevent economic collapse. His appeal came as the European community widened its emergency relief effort in Russia, but not all the aid is getting to those who need it. Kevin Dunn of Independent Television News reports from Moscow.
For the children of Russia, this may be their first winter free of communism, but it may also be the hungriest of their lives. Russia predicts more than 50 million people will need help, and the first emergency aid from the West has only just begun to trickle through. For 29-year-old Alla Zubakova, it could not have come too soon. She and her 9-month-old daughter Daria qualify for free baby food donated by the European community. She says the price of glasnost and perestroika is so painful, she and her husband cannot afford to have another child. Feeding one is hard enough. We will do all we can for her, she says. We will starve ourselves to feed her, to keep her warm, healthy and fed. The problem is this aid can help only 330 families for a month. 330 out of a community of 60,000. The bulk of the emergency aid is actually being sold. German butter on the market at 56 rubles a kilo, the equivalent of 3 days' pay. There have been reports that some aid ends up on the black market, but it's difficult to know how much, and the European community says it's controlling the food distribution as strictly as it can.
So that we're going to be watching very carefully what happens. Not the sale of every kilo of butter, but in general terms, we're going to be monitoring very seriously what is happening in the different shops.
Food is arriving, but so far very little. And Russia says it needs millions of tons more if it is to prevent months of hardship from turning into a winter of starvation.
In U.S. economic news today, the Commerce Department reported that housing starts fell last year to the lowest level since World War II. New construction of single-family homes and apartments dropped almost 15% in 1991. But the report showed signs of an upturn at the end of the year as mortgage interest rates hit an 18-year low. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve today released its latest survey of business activity. It called the economy lackluster as 1991 ended, but said business executives still expect things to improve by mid-year. For his part, President Bush said today, the American people are expecting him and Congress to revive the economy. But at a White House appearance, he said he would fight any plan that increased government spending.
Our proposal will try to avoid that kind of politically popular approach, but we'll focus on those things that will encourage jobs, investment, savings, and I think the American people see that there's blame to be shared all around on all of this. But I will make the strong view that, hey, this is a tough one, but let's try to get something done that's going to get this country back to work, that's going to create jobs, and we'll see. That's the approach I'll take, and I will resist and fight against things that won't do that, that'll make the situation work, and I'll fight very hard for things that I think will make it better.
Mr. Bush today nominated Andrew Card to be Secretary of Transportation. Card has been White House Deputy Chief of Staff under John Sununu for the last 3 years. Before that, he was a Massachusetts state legislator and later worked in the Reagan administration. If confirmed, he would replace Samuel Skinner, who left the Transportation Department to become White House Chief of Staff.
Thousands of anti-abortion activists marched in Washington today. They were marking the 19th anniversary of Roe versus Wade, the U.S. Supreme Court decision which legalized abortions. President Bush addressed the crowd by a loudspeaker hookup from the White House. He told them, "I am there with you in spirit." A smaller group of abortion rights activists marched nearby, leading to heckling on both sides.
The Space Shuttle Discovery began a week-long research mission today. It blasted off from Cape Canaveral this morning. The launch was delayed for about an hour by concerns about the weather. The 7-member crew is made up of 5 Americans, 1 Canadian, and a German. They will perform experiments on a variety of living organisms, including themselves.
Israeli troops arrested dozens of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank today. An army statement said they were looking for those responsible for recent attacks on Jewish settlers. 5 West Bank settlers have been killed by gunfire in the past 3 months. In Washington, CIA Director Robert Gates said the Mideast peace talks could bring terrorist attacks. He said state-sponsored terrorism had declined, but terrorism by independent groups remained a serious threat. He said it in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee.
We can foresee several potential terrorist trouble spots in coming years. Developments in the Arab-Israeli peace process, for example, are likely to stimulate attacks against various participants, including the United States, by groups opposed to the negotiations.
German officials said today they seized a shipment of U.S.-made equipment bound for Libya. They said the equipment could have been used in a military nuclear program. It was on a plane about to take off from Frankfurt when it was intercepted last month. The leader of Algeria's Muslim fundamentalist party was arrested today. The government also banned all public gatherings around mosques. The Muslim party was expected to win national elections this month, but they were called off 2 weeks ago.
That's it for the news summary. Now it's on to big salaries for big business people and the high cost of murder.
A salary dispute is where we begin tonight. It's the one over the pay of some American business executives. The issue was unintentionally raised recently by the government's top executive. Correspondent Tom Bearden explains.
It was President Bush's controversial trade mission to Japan that generated the most recent wave of headlines about CEO pay. Bush and 21 American executives who traveled with him had come to batter at the gates of the allegedly closed Japanese economy. But the Japanese had a ready retort. Look at the enormous income of the CEOs who were complaining. The men who run Detroit's Big Three took the most battering. Ford's Harold Poling, $1.29 million. Chrysler's Lee Iacocca, $4.65 million. And General Motors' Robert Stempel, $2.18 million. By contrast, the heads of Japan's Big Three took home a total of $1.8 million. It has since ballooned into a public debate about the fairness of some American CEOs making big money, even as they were laying off thousands of workers and posting annual losses. GM, for example, recently announced it was eliminating 74,000 jobs. The controversy over how much the boss makes isn't new. Every spring, about the time most corporations hold their annual meetings, the business press lists the salaries of the highest paid executives. In 1948, Forbes magazine did an informal survey and reported that DuPont's Walter S. Carpenter made $175,000. Today's figures make that kind of salary seem quaintly out of date. In 1990, according to both Forbes and Businessweek, Time Warner's Stephen J. Ross earned more than $78 million. United Airlines' Stephen Wolf took home $18.3 million. John Scully of Apple Computer, $16.7 million. Reebok's Paul Fireman, $14.8 million. Dean Buntrock of Waste Management, over $12 million. Lists like these usually generate a few letters to the editor, and then the whole thing dies down until the next list. This year, it hasn't died, and there are some reasons for that. The Japan trip was very high profile. The public always pays more attention when there's a recession on, and it's a visible target for politicians in an election year.
While they were laying thousands of their employees off, raised executive compensation by far more than their profits went up, and far more than the economic growth of this country increased. The person that presided over all that, upon retirement, got his retirement increase to $1.2 million a year in retirement. How many salaries for auto workers would that pay?
It's very difficult to justify some of the really very high-paid executives in this country, especially when you look at the performance of the companies. And there's no reason at all that shareholders and board of directors ought to be more adamant in making sure that executive compensation is somehow related to productivity. And I would think that might go a long way to beginning to get a different type of behavior, a different type of culture, a different type of attitude in the American business community.
Once it was pretty simple to analyze how much a CEO made. You just looked at his salary. It's much more complicated now, a hodgepodge of salary, bonuses, and stock options. Ira Kay is the managing director of executive compensation at the Hay Group.
A stock option is the right, but not the obligation, to purchase a share of stock at a fixed price over a given time period. And the importance about the obligation piece is that if the stock price declines, the executive or anyone is not forced to exercise at a loss. Stock options are very valuable, and they've been around for 30 or 40 years as a very important part of executive pay programs.
For example, the CEO gets an option to buy stock at $100 a share. If it goes up to, say, $150, he still gets to buy it for $100. The whole idea is to tie compensation to performance. If the CEO does a good job, the company's stock goes up. The CEO makes money, and so do the stockholders. But critics say it's often all upside and no downside. For example, a great deal of the $18 million that United Airlines CEO Stephen Wolf made came in the form of stock options in a year when his company's profits were down 71%. Forbes estimated that Time Warner CEO Stephen Ross collected an $800,000 salary, a $2 million bonus, $400,000 in deferred compensation, and options on 1.8 million shares of stock, even as the company was reporting a $227 million loss. A lot of people are asking if any CEO is worth that kind of money. That's always been the fundamental question. In 1948, DuPont's Walter Carpenter told Forbes he was worth every nickel of his $175,000. In a 4-page letter, Carpenter said, "I believe competitors would be willing to pay as much. I believe the company's interest is better served by paying that compensation." Some congressmen are talking about changing tax laws that allow corporations to write off the full cost of executive compensation. Some would put a cap on allowable deductions. Kay says the ultimate test should be whether the incentives are actually working.
Our studies have shown, first of all, on the pay for performance issue, that there is a relationship between the pay of top management and the performance of their companies. For example, we found that for the chief executive officers for very large companies in the United States last year, that there was a direct relationship between their profitability, their financial performance, and their bonuses.
But Kay also believes that 20% of U.S. corporations do overpay their executives and should adjust their compensation packages to make sure they really do equate pay with performance.
Earlier today, we debated executive pay with Ralph Whitworth, president of the United Shareholders Association, an advocacy group for corporate stockholders' rights. U.S. Representative Martin SABO, Democrat from Minnesota, who has introduced legislation to encourage companies to limit executive pay. And Greg JARRELL, a professor of finance and economics at the Simon Business School at the University of Rochester. Formerly, he was the chief economist for the Securities and Exchange Commission. He joins us from Rochester. Let me begin with you, Mr. Whitworth. Do you agree some executives are paid too much?
Absolutely. It's not just some, it's most executives. And
so the 20% figure you wouldn't agree with?
That's way low. But really, the amount they're paid isn't the issue as much as how they're paid. And that's the problem in this country. And the fact that there's no linkage between their pay and performance. And the reason that is because they're basically setting their own pay. There's no accountability in the system.
Well, but I want to get into that, but before you say most executives are overpaid, what do you mean? I mean, just grossly overpaid? What kind of a percentage are we talking about here?
Percentage terms?
Yes.
Overpaid? Well, it ranges all the way from Stephen Ross, as was mentioned on the tape, who was paid $83 million last year, to somebody like Lee Iacocca at $4.6 million. I mean, there's 90% of the executives in this country that are overpaid.
Mr. JARRELL, would you agree with that?
Well, I can understand the problem, but I certainly don't agree with that. I think it's a gross exaggeration. I would agree more with perhaps the 20% overpaid, and I think that there are numerous studies on this subject that are quite well done, and I just don't think that there's enough evidence to support it. I think that those are allegations, but I don't think that there's any type of support for it. What we really see here is a few individuals that are glaring examples of abuse, and based upon that, we're sort of condemning an entire system, and I don't think that's fair.
All right, let me get back to your point, Mr. Whitworth. It's not, you saying it's not so much how much they're overpaid, but the way that their pay is figured. How is the pay figured in most cases?
It's, for the most part, executive pay in this country is based on size. How large the company is, what their sales are, how many employees they have, revenues. And really, size is meaningless. Because if you base it on size, what you end up with is a bunch of empire builders. The larger the company, the higher the pay. And the way it should be set, if this country is going to get competitive again, and if we're going to send the right message to employees, and if we're going to have the right incentives for our leaders, is on results. Because results are what shareholders are looking for, that's what our workers are looking for, and instead it's based on size. And there's
so you're saying no matter, even if it's a small company, if it makes a lot of money, or vice versa, if it's a big company and doesn't make a lot of money, then what? What are you saying?
It should be pay for performance. And if the performance, if the company's doing well, and the stock price is going up, then the sky should be the limit. But when the profits are going down and the stock price is flat, then the executives should suffer. And do you know what they do? They take a 20% pay cut. So they go from making $2 million to $1.6 million, and they struggle on.
Is that a formula you can live with, Mr. JARRELL?
Well, no, I mean, I really don't. I think that the solution is not to start cutting pay if the executives don't perform or if the company doesn't perform. I think that it should be more like managers in baseball or football. If the team has a couple of bad years, you don't go back and cut their salary by 20%, you fire them. And I think the boards of directors have to be more aggressive at firing the executives. I don't think that the pay for performance is necessarily the issue. I think that the pay ought to drop to zero if the performance is substandard.
But you don't disagree with Mr. Whitworth's analysis that many executives are being paid based on the performance of the company.
I base my opinion on the 30 or 40 first-rate academic studies that have been published in scholarly journals, and it simply is not true that there is not pay for performance. You can argue about whether there's a strong enough degree of an association between pay and performance, but the studies show that the level of pay of corporate executives in this country is indeed related to the performance of the companies, stock price and accounting performance, and more importantly, the turnover rate of corporate executives is related to corporate performance.
Okay, I think I misspoke a moment ago. I was meaning to say that you said pay is not tied to performance, and he corrected me in the answer.
We completed an extensive study that we released in November, and it showed that 4% of the difference in executive pay could be linked to performance. And that's virtually no linkage.
4%?
4% of the difference in executive pay.
All right, how do you explain the discrepancy between what you found and these other studies that Mr. Jarrell is citing?
Well, I don't know the 30 studies he's citing, but there is a lot of academic work on this, and I would argue with his statement that all of them say that there is pay for performance. In fact, most of the studies I've seen say that there's a miserable lack of pay for performance in this country.
Let me bring you into this, Congressman Sabo. You've introduced legislation. It's a subject that you've expressed an interest in. Do you think, well, let me put it this way, to what extent do you think corporate executives in this country are overpaid?
They clearly are overpaid in relationship to what other people are earning. We've had a dramatic polarization of income in this country over the last 12, 15 years. In 1977, the bottom 40% in our society had income twice that of the top 1%. In 1988, it was 50-50. We've had stagnation in the salary for most people, rapid escalation of corporate salaries through the 1980s. I think that goes contrary to the basic fabric of our democratic society.
And you're saying that it's in too many companies, is what you're saying?
Well, when one looks at salaries in this country in comparison to salaries of corporate executives in other countries, clearly we're very, very high. But I would suggest that even if we had a perfect system of rewarding good corporate executives, a profitable company, those rewards should go throughout all employees rather than simply the top executives.
So you wouldn't agree even with Mr. Whitworth's point that if the company's doing very well, then the top executives ought to be paid in accordance with it?
I think they should be paid in accordance, but I think all employees should share.
All right, your proposal, in a nutshell, would do what?
We would simply say that for corporate income taxes, you could deduct the salary that was 25 times that of the lowest paid employee. So as a company became more profitable, as the lowest paid employee went up, the deductibility for the top employee would also go up.
Is that something that makes sense, Mr. Jarrell?
Absolutely not. I think that that's socialism, pure and simple. I think that first off, that's a strange way to try to benefit shareholders would be to essentially increase their corporate income tax take by denying the deductibility of legitimate business expenses. Boards of directors are out there in this country, and their job is to set contracts between managements and the firms, and there's simply no evidence that they're failing in this job across the board. Secondly, any comparisons with other countries have to be done extremely carefully, and that has not been done to date. There's just a lot of anecdotal evidence, some numbers taken out of the media, and it's the worst type of way to try to set legislation. I think that legislation would be a disaster.
Mr. Whitworth, how do you feel about this type legislation?
Well, I have to agree with Professor Jarrell on this issue. You know, when I hear these sort of egalitarian approaches and income leveling approaches, they just really don't make sense. Now, because how is government going to go in and start deciding what's the right formula, 25, 20 times? But more than that, the taxes, what happens is when government has tried this type of approach before, is that the executives go ahead and pay themselves, and then they pay the taxes too, because after all, it's not their money to pay the taxes. It's the company's money, and so the shareholders end up getting hit twice. They overpay the executive, then they have to pay a tax on it.
What about that, Mr. Sabo?
They might. I think it would, however, have the opposite impact on their decisions. And I'd have to say that a company exists...
But you don't know that for a fact.
No, they might. They might. But I think there's a need for the public sector to say the type of income polarization that's going on in this country is wrong, and we need to begin to change that pattern.
People at the top getting so much more, people at the bottom getting
so little,
comparatively less.
That's right. And I'm also struck by the conversation. It seems that companies exist simply for the shareholders and top management. They also exist for their employees. And I think you need some pattern of equity between the top and the people who are working throughout the company.
Well, what about that point?
Well, the answer, though, is not to give more power to Congress to start dictating how people are paid in this country. The answer is to give more power to those people who Congressman Sabo says are treated unfairly. Give more power to employees in this area. Let them have a shot at getting somebody on the board of directors. Give more power to the shareholders and bring some accountability through market pressures. That's what's worked in this country, not Congress dictating pay levels.
You'd like to see shareholders do what? I mean, have what role in determining
Okay, first of all, I'd like shareholders to be able to actually elect a board of directors, because in this country, they don't do that. The management appoints the board of directors, and whether the shareholders vote for them, against them, or not at all, they only get the management slate. Then the board would actually be working for the shareholders. I'd also like them...
Let me ask Mr. Jarrell. What about that, Mr. Jarrell? Would that work?
Well, I think that would help things. I do agree with Ralph and many others that we can make the proxy system work better, and I do think that some boards of directors have been dropping the ball on this and other issues, and I think that those sorts of ideas that Ralph and the United Shareholders Association put forth have a great deal of merit.
What was your other point? I interrupted you before you were going on to number two.
Well, the other thing that I would say is that give the shareholders more ability to have a direct voice on this through the annual meeting and through other mechanisms in what we call corporate democracy.
But should they be allowed to vote, are you saying, on how much pay?
Not on the level of the pay. We don't want shareholders to micromanage the precise level of executive pay, but on the process of how the pay is set and the criteria, whether it's pay for performance or not, absolutely. Those are the kinds of issues that shareholders should be voting on and sending a strong message to the board of directors.
And Mr. Jarrell, you wouldn't have a problem with any of that?
Well, no, I do have a problem with that. What I'm saying is that you can imagine reforming the proxy system, but what we're now talking about is allowing shareholders to vote on particular measures of the pay package with corporate executives. I think that that's an ordinary, normal business transaction between the board and management. I think that to the extent that there's a problem, that the board can correct it, and I don't think that that allowing that to be on something that shareholders vote on is something. They should kick the board out if they don't like the way that board's doing that and other things. But I do think that that's beginning to get micromanagement. I do think that that's beginning to politicize the process, and I think that that would have harmful effects on the ability of corporations to get good managers, to attract them and to hold them, and goodness knows we need more efficiency in our top management ranks.
Just quickly, Mr. Sabo, why wouldn't it be enough to do what Mr. Whitworth and Mr. Jarrell are talking about?
Because the problem is much more fundamental than simply the mechanics of corporate management. The most fundamental problem we face in this country today is the incredible polarization of income between top and bottom. Everyone stagnant except the very top, which has been growing very rapidly during the 1980s.
But Mr. Whitworth, you don't believe that's something that the government ought to get involved in fixing?
No, because what we have is special deals for special people. And the reason that we have special people is because we're letting them run their own private fiefdoms. And we need to arrest that and get a hold of it, put some reins on these people, put some heat under their seats so that they go to get back to the workbench instead of running to Japan crying, running to Washington crying. And that's really, it's that simple.
Well, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Mr. Jarrell, Mr. Whitworth, Congressman Sabo, we thank you all for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Murder is next. More than 24,000 Americans were murdered last year, the worst year for homicide in the country's history. A discussion of the causes follows this backgrounder by KWAME HOLMAN that centers on a city that has seen some of the worst of the violence, our capital city, Washington, D.C.
Like the wild, wild west, it's calamity, but D.C. don't mean that city.
But Washington, D.C. has been compared to the gunslinging Dodge City of the Old West. That's because in recent years, no city exemplified more graphically the national epidemic of murder than the nation's capital. Washington's murder rate has risen every year since 1987, when the tidal wave of crack cocaine and its attendant violence took a firm hold on much of urban America. In 1987, there were 228 murders in Washington. By the end of 1991, homicides had more than doubled to 489.
Each day of this year, each day of this week, brings with it another story about a new killing and another random act of violence. Who could ever imagine that it would come to this? That the security of a child's bedroom could be pierced by bullets in the dead of night. Funeral homes actually replacing playgrounds as a gathering place for our children. Who could imagine?
Washington Mayor Sharon Pratt Kelly, in office 12 months, has inherited the tough questions about why years of anti-violence initiatives by the city government, citizens, and federal law enforcement agencies have done little to stop the carnage.
Mayor, right now, who controls the streets, especially in the late evening hours, the cop or the crook?
I'd say that I wouldn't say the crooks control it. I say they just keep us very, very busy.
We know a lot about violence, but we haven't been able to develop overall comprehensive strategies.
And, says Washington Police Chief Isaac Fullwood, while those strategies are being developed, homicides are following a disturbing trend.
The murderers, the people that are being murdered, are younger. The average age is about 27.5 years. It is, in fact, a black male. The number of people that are being arrested for murder are, in fact, getting younger. Most of the murders still revolve around drugs and fights over territory and turf.
I used to carry guns, and I done had guns stuck in my mouth, and I was scared to death of it. You know, but it's all a part of that life, living on the street, dealing drugs, the fast life. You know, but easy come, easy go, and that's how it is.
Curtis Artis, known as Foots, once was part of that life. He has seen firsthand the violence that is centered in and around Washington's predominantly black, predominantly poor neighborhoods.
Basically, what we want to do with this meeting is kind of pinpoint activities and stuff.
An ex-convict at 21, Artis now works with other Washington young people on an anti-violence task force sponsored by Police Chief Fullwood.
In a lot of broken homes, a young person tends to see things that they shouldn't see. You know, like an uncle or father robbing people or doing things like that. So a young guy, he'll grow up thinking, well, if my father can do it, I can do it.
Geneva Barr also has lived with the violent realities present in many Washington neighborhoods. Recently, Barr took over the care of two of her grandchildren. Their mother, Barr's daughter, is a drug addict who Barr has banned from the home. A social worker told Barr her daughter's welfare checks could be made payable to Barr, but to do so, she would have to file a formal action against her daughter.
It's not easy. If anybody thinks it is, it's not. But you have to come to the point where you have to use tough love, and it's tough when you lose it. You know, it's tough. You need something that's going to sting them and let them know that, hey, the party's over, you know? And nobody expected when they born their children into the world that 20 years later, 18, 15 years later, that they were going to be involved in this or they're going to be shot down by each other.
Officials hope by reaching out to citizens like Barr, families can be kept together, reducing the chances young people will turn to crime. The mayor also plans to restore money for drug treatment that was cut last year. And like cities nationwide, Washington is returning to an old way of policing, the cop on the beat. Officer George Bellinger supervises beat officers who work with residents of violence-plagued neighborhoods like this public housing development.
What we are trying to do now
is to try to get them to understand that the police department is not against them, that we're working together as a team in the community where we can bridge that communication gap, where we can set up programs for the kids, where we can give them some outlet.
Washington officials also have invested great hope in direct citizen action, like neighborhood patrols by members of the Nation of Islam and other groups, as a critical tool in regaining control of the streets. While such efforts have had limited success, a new, more intractable kind of violence recently has shaken the city.
I ask you a question. Where is the love? When the love comes, then the killings will stop.
First came the murder of the younger brother of the late University of Maryland basketball star Len Bias. Jay Bias was gunned down in a Washington suburb, apparently for flirting with a young woman. Then, last November, the shocking case of a black teenager charged with the fatal shooting of a stranger in the next car for no apparent reason.
One witness claims James said, "I feel like killing somebody," and fired one shot into a passing automobile.
That's why it was shocking. Because before that, we said, oh, they're a bunch of drug dealers. They killed each other. And we kind of halfway said, well, that's all right. But now, here's this innocent person, uninvolved in anything illegal or criminal, minding their business, going down the highway, who is murdered. We now have to say to ourselves, it can happen to us. Therefore, we must mobilize.
Police say guns in Washington are more deadly and as abundant as ever, and there's little hesitation about using them.
When you have a gun or any type of weapon on the street, you have power, and people think twice about approaching you in a negative way. So then when you got two people that got a gun and they're arguing with one another, they really don't care, you know. They say, he got a gun, well, I got a gun too, so what does that mean? You know, so it's whoever pulls the trigger first. That's how people think, you know. For one, to start with, more education needs to be done. More emphasis on living instead of dying. People aren't scared to die anymore, they're scared to live.
In the face of such attitudes, Mayor Kelly also has proposed that serious offenders as young as 14 be tried as adults, and the city is reconsidering a nighttime curfew on young people. Such measures have some local politicians wondering if the system is overreacting to the crisis of violence, but no one seems quite certain what else to do.
Yesterday, Charlene Hunter-GAULT talked with some experts about possible solutions.
We get three perspectives now on how to curb the growing violence on our nation's streets. Lawrence Sherman is a professor of criminology at the University of Maryland and is president of the Crime Control Institute in Washington, D.C., a non-profit research organization. Deborah PROTHROW STITH is the assistant dean for government and community programs at the Harvard School of Public Health. She's the former health commissioner for the state of Massachusetts. She's in Chattanooga, Tennessee tonight. Gary KLECK is a professor of criminology at Florida State University. He's the author of the book Point Blank, Guns and Violence in America. He joins us from the studios of public station WSSU in Tallahassee. And starting with you, Larry Sherman, for me this is like deja vu all over again. We had this conversation this time last year when the statistics for 1990 were horrendous.
It's only gotten worse.
It's gotten worse. Are there new elements in the equation? Is it the same thing? What's happening?
Well, there's a number of things going on. I think the most important is the steadily increasing availability of handguns in some communities, more so than others. For example, while it's obvious that this is a problem that's concentrated in poor black neighborhoods in big cities, some big cities have much lower rates of black homicide than others. Chicago, for example, is 1/3 the rate per capita of black homicides as New York City. Same contrast can be found between San Francisco and Baltimore. And we still don't understand enough about what explains those differences or why Washington is is 50% higher than Detroit, for example, when social conditions are generally thought to be worse in Detroit. So I think we have to view this as a terribly complex problem, as hard to deal with as AIDS or other major medical issues, and we're not investing any research in trying to understand the causes, which might give us a better idea about the cures.
But essentially your view is that a large part of it is guns.
I think the fact that handgun homicide has risen 17% in the last 5 years, while overall homicide has only risen 4%, is a good indication that the growing supply of handguns in this country has a lot to do with it.
Mr. KLECK, what's your view of this, why the rate is rising, continues to rise?
Well, if we're talking about the rate in the United States, there is no epidemic of murder in the United States as a whole. There's only been a rather slight increase in murder in the last few years. In Washington, there's an extraordinary rise, but there's no reason to believe that it's attributable to guns in general or handguns, because we have no direct evidence, aside from the killings themselves, that there is this increase in handgun ownership or gun ownership in general. Indeed, the purpose of the 1977 Washington, D.C. gun law was to restrict gun ownership. If it was to have any effect, it should have reduced the number of guns. Washington has a lower gun ownership rate than other cities in America, and yet a far higher violence rate. All of these facts are exactly contrary to what you would expect if, in fact, handgun levels were responsible for the high murder rate.
So what do you think is?
Well, Washington, D.C. has mainly seen an increase in crack cocaine trafficking during this exact same period. There you have a very nice correspondence between trends in the purported cause and trends in the violence rates.
But essentially you're saying that in other parts of the country you think there is what Kwame referred to in the piece as an overreaction?
With respect to what?
To the to the murder rate. You're saying that it's not as bad as all that.
No, nationally it's not all that bad in terms of trend. It's a serious problem. There's no doubt about that. It's just a problem that's not getting much worse. It's a problem that we have to do something about, but not something we have to be panicked into. We don't have to start choosing extreme alternatives under the impression that we're about to go over the cliff.
All right, I'll come back to you on that in a minute. Deborah PROTHROW, STITH, what's your sense, perception or whatever, about this point? Is it getting worse?
I think, in fact, most cities have experienced an increase in young adolescent homicides over the last few years, and that it's a very complicated issue. Guns certainly have a role to play. Drug use, and not just crack cocaine, but alcohol has a role to play. Economic issues are an important part of this, because we've certainly seen a divestment in terms of cities over the last decade. So it is a complicated problem with just a lot of factors contributing to its increase, and we are seeing an increase.
Let me just go back on this one point to try and clarify what Mr. KLECK just said, that there's no evidence that the long-term, that the trends is in the direction of increasing murder rates, and that there is perhaps a slight overreaction.
I don't think there's any overreaction in the cities that are experiencing record homicides, and you could tick off a long list of those cities for this past year. And the fact that Washington has now a higher homicide rate than any city, to my knowledge, has had in the 20th century, suggests not that we should overreact, not that we should adopt extremes, but that we should view this as an extremely serious problem, one that is of very recent origin. I mean, the fact that that gun law did work in the late 70s for a time being, and that there was a small but significant reduction in homicide, suggests that something changed in the late 80s when crack did come to Washington. And one of the things that some economists think is that it put cash in the hands of teenagers, who then decided that owning a powerful semi-automatic pistol was as fashionable as the hula hoop, and that it was necessary for them to go out. And so now we see in Washington a declining number of aggravated assaults, which includes shootings, but a rising number of deaths. And that means that for each shooting incident, the odds of dying are greater. And that suggests more multiple bullet wounds of the kind that killed Jay Bias.
But is it just in Washington, or is it in urban centers across America?
I think urban centers across America are...
Excuse
me just a minute. Deborah PROTHROW, STITH?
I was saying it's in urban centers across America. And You know, this list of factors does include guns, but it also includes our attitudes about violence. We have promoted violence. We have taught children that violence is the superhero's way to solve a problem. And all that comes together to contribute to an American problem. Urban centers have higher rates. Almost everywhere there has been a slight increase to a very dramatic increase like you have in Washington.
Mr. KLECK, the Senate Judiciary Committee issued a report this month on causes in which it included guns, drugs, and demographics. Well, do you have any sense of demographics from your perspective and how that may be affecting this rate?
As to how it affects the trend, the trend in demographics is actually one that should have produced a drop in homicide. Throughout the 1980s, the fraction of the population in the high homicide ages was going down, basically as the baby boomers aged out of the high violence groups. The demographics, for what it's worth, are actually favorable to violence. If they weren't, there would be a far greater increase in the murder rate. Instead, we're seeing a relatively mild increase in the murder rate in the United States as a whole, not just selected cities here and there, but for the U.S. as a whole. If you subtract out the drug-related killings, the United States has seen maybe a 6% increase in the murder rate in the last 4 years, and I suspect that's one of the reasons it's as mild as it is because the demographics were not unfavorable. So if there's anything responsible for the mild increase in the murder rate, it's something else.
But the demographics in inner cities have changed. The evidence from the Urban Institute and other researchers studying the so-called underclass problem demonstrates that the growth of neighborhoods with concentrated poverty, concentrated single-parent households, concentrated pathologies of all kinds, the proportion of young people living in those kinds of neighborhoods has grown very rapidly.
And what accounts for this propensity to violence, you think?
Well, in that kind of ecological setting, you have a much greater combination of factors favorable to using guns, to using violence as a way of expressing your dignity. That's really, in effect, the only way you have of maintaining your status, of feeling good about yourself, because you don't see much hope for yourself ever having a job. You don't know anybody who does have a job. You don't see yourself fitting into mainstream society. And so typically when you have a group shut out like that, they you know, turn their anger on themselves, or however you want to say it. But that seems to be what's going on in this ecological setting.
I can only agree with all that, except to point out that's not demographics. That's economics and the consequences of economics.
Do you agree with that? Sorry.
That indeed is the heart of the violence problem. A large underclass, people who have no hope for the future, who figure there's no reason why they shouldn't risk their lives either dealing in crack, using crack, getting involved in dangerous crimes like robberies and so on. People who have nothing to lose.
Yeah.
Deborah PROTHROW, you disagree?
Well, I don't think we can simplify the problem of poverty. We don't know what it is about poverty that places people at risk. Certainly there's the frustration of being poor, there's the classism and the racism that sometimes goes with it. But poor children watch more television. Often there is not an adult man in the house to counter some of those superhero macho images. So we really don't, I don't want to oversimplify poverty and say people have no hope. We have to look at this problem of violence as one where we've taught children to use violence, and we can't act like we don't understand it. That's all Rambo, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Total. That's all they do is use violence and enjoy it, and that's what the kids see.
All right, let me ask Larry Sherman. We just go on briefly to solutions, since clearly the causes are extreme and multiple. There is a specific plan that you know and know about and are working with in Kansas City. What is it and how is it working?
What we're recommending to the Kansas City Police Department, and indeed other police departments around the country, is a program of community policing against guns. It's a 4-point effort that begins with the standard community policing method of uniformed officers getting to know the community by going door to door, introducing themselves, and trying to enlist the help of the citizens in accomplishing a specific program. Now, Washington has community policing, but they don't focus on the question of guns, and specifically on getting citizens to give the police anonymous tips about who's illegally carrying a gun, when and where. And so we recommend establishing a tips hotline that citizens can call with anonymity guarantee and say there's somebody carrying a gun at this street corner. Then the police can respond, and based not only on the tip, but with the addition of handheld metal detectors to avoid touching anybody until there's some confirmation of them carrying a gun, just as we see in airports and courthouses and every time we hear President Bush speak, using the handheld metal detectors to protect suspects' rights. But if there is a confirmation, then to do a frisk, which is constitutional under Terry v. Ohio, and then if there's a gun, to make the arrest and to get the gun off the streets, even if the courts are too busy to do much with the charges.
Mr. KLECK, what do you think of that approach?
Well, I have no objection to dealing with guns being carried on the streets, and there might be some benefit. It turns out that probably impulsive robberies are the kind of crime that's most likely to be prevented by getting guns literally off the street to slow down the carrying of guns. What bothers me is the use of these handheld metal detectors on the streets.
What bothers you about that?
Well, the notion that these are going to be selectively directed just at those people who, with the police, for whom the police have anonymous tips is pretty bizarre, because once the technology is there, legally authorized and routinely used, it will be applied to everyone the police find on the street. It can be applied to people in automobiles as well.
It all depends on how a police department wants to manage the use of the metal detectors. Some would argue that they're not even necessary. I think that when we're moving into a very aggressive program to try to get guns off the streets, that we have to be sensitive to the fact that tips, an anonymous hotline tips, can sometimes be made in malice. They can be in error. The police officer might spot the wrong person. And so the metal detector is just one more additional safeguard of the suspect's rights.
Ms. PROTHROW, STITH, what do you think about that plan?
Well, I think, first of all, focusing on guns is important, but we have to understand that that alone won't solve the problem. In Philadelphia, for instance, knives are the major cause of death for young black men, and stabbings. So guns are important. Focusing on getting them off the street is important, but we've got to look at the broader picture, and that includes looking at anger, looking at attitudes about violence, looking at some healthy things for kids to do, and dealing with some of the economic options. That's all got to be a part of the picture. I couldn't prevent heart disease by just doing better surgery. I'd have to deal with exercise, diet, smoking. And we are not going to prevent homicide by doing better policing. We've got to deal with drug treatment. We've got to deal with getting guns off the street, and we've got to deal with our attitudes about violence and what we teach our children.
But I view policing as getting the high-fat diet out of the body. If you get the guns off the street, that's prevention.
Okay, let me ask Mr. KLECK. Mr. KLECK, what's your solution in a word or two?
Well, getting guns off the street is almost entirely irrelevant to homicide. As I said, it's probably relevant only to robbery. Instead, we've got to do something that's at the heart of the problem, but that's expensive. The reason policymakers turn to trivial little stuff like modifying how police patrol and exactly what they do out there when they're doing it is because it strikes them as cheap. It's politically cheap, and it doesn't cost any money. You want to solve the problem of violence, you solve the problem of poverty and inequality and what that generates. In particular, what it generates is devastated families, children who grow up without both parents in the household, and sometimes no parent at all, who have nobody who teaches them their society's morality, people who will teach them that there is hope for the future and that they can get a legitimate job and join the rest of society.
Is that a realistic option, though, in this current economic climate? Jobs, I mean,
it's more realistic than it's ever been. Now we have 1,000 reasons why the government ought to be involved in generating jobs, good-paying jobs, through public works programs and so on, just like during the New Deal period. There's more reason than ever to do it now.
I'd like to discuss these solutions in greater detail because they're so fascinating, but we don't have the time. I do want to just do a quick wraparound with each of you on the question that disturbed me the most about what I heard, and that is, how do you address this new breed of murderers out there who show no remorse and who are old enough to be having kids to whom I'm told they are passing on these kinds of values. That may be too much to deal with right now, but Deborah Prothrow Stith, are we producing a culture
We really are.
Of where violence is the value?
We really are producing that kind of culture. And we can't act like we don't understand it. I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger in Total Recall, shoots his wife in the head. Then he uses a bystander to shield himself, and there's no remorse. In fact, he makes it funny, by saying, well, that's a divorce, or this is a bad day. Then we have the audacity to act like we don't understand it when kids don't show remorse and empathy. That's something you learn, and we have to teach that both to parents and to children.
Mr. Clark, what's your view on that, briefly?
Well, the people you're describing are not people who are learning anything from their parents, because in most cases they're not even in contact with them. They, for all practical purposes, have no parents. Often they've never seen their father. Their mother they may have intermittent contact with. They're not learning much of anything. It's not that they're having those values passed on. Rather, they're simply growing up what you might say is in a state of nature.
Do you see any hope?
What kind of sense does that make? No other country has our homicide. What does state of nature mean?
State of nature is precisely what the human species would be doing were it not taught any sort of moral standards.
No, but excuse me, Dr.
There is no such devastation of the family going on, and that's why those other countries do not have that kind of a homicide rate.
All right, I just want to get a quick response from Larry Sherman, and unfortunately we're going to have to let it go at that.
The homicide rate by juveniles doubled in the last 5 years. I don't think violence in movies has doubled. I don't think that single-parent households have doubled. I think what's perhaps doubled is the supply of guns available to teenagers who use guns for the kinds of things they used to use their fists over girls and funny looks. And I think until we take the guns away from the people who show no remorse, they're going to go on using them, and that's our challenge.
Well, Mr. Sherman, Mr. Kleck in Florida, and Deborah Prothrow Stith, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, the main stories of this Wednesday. President Bush proposed giving an additional $645 million of U.S. aid to the former Soviet republics. The construction of new homes fell last year in this country to the lowest level since World War II. And the Federal Reserve released its latest survey of business activity. It called the economy lackluster, but said business executives expect things to improve by the middle of this year. Good night, Jim.
Good night, Judy. We'll see you tomorrow night with full coverage of the conference on how to bring help to Russia and the other former Soviet republics. I'm Jim Lehrer. Thank you and good night.
Part of helping the world live and communicate better is keeping it well informed. That's why funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour is provided by AT&T and by PepsiCo. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
Videocassettes of the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour are available from PBS Video. Call 1-800-328-PBS-1. This is PBS.
Acquisition of this program was made possible by Friends of Iowa Public Television. And funding for the Iowa broadcast is provided by Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, since 1861, an environment for academic excellence. And by CRST, a family-owned company based in Iowa and a major truck carrier in the United States, which is proud to support the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour.
You're viewing Iowa Public Television. Enjoy more TV worth watching in 1/2 hour.
On the next National Geographic special,